Hi there, BookTube. It's Roz. Now, you know, when I read a relatively newly published book, I will, if I can, do a standalone review to give you an idea of whether you might like to add it to your future list of possibilities to read. And this time, I'm going to talk about Me Ishmaelle by Xiaolu Guo, which was published in, I think, April, maybe March of this year, 2025, and which I just finished. But before I go into any detail about this particular novel, I'm just going to go off a bit about historical fiction. Why? Because in June is the Historical Fiction Readathon. Bunch of lovely hosts. I'll list them below because there's slightly too many to list here. And that means that I've been using that as an excuse to read quite a bit of historical fiction this June, which is something that I love. And this, I think, will be the fourth standalone review I've done this month that's of a book that happens to be historical fiction. There's Days of Light by Megan Hunter, The Mare by Angharad, Hampshire, and Whaleful by Elizabeth O'Connor, which was a discussion video with Tilly. Now, when I talked about this one, The Mare by Angharad, Hampshire, I talked a bit also about why I am so enthusiastic as a reader of historical fiction, why I've realised that it brings me so much sort of pleasure and variety, I suppose. And I think that's because, you know, historical fiction can run the gamut of your sort of reading options almost. You know, it can be challenging, literary, innovative. It can be cozy, commercial. You know, it can be thrillerish. It can be romantic. You know, it's just that it's in a historical setting, and this kind of got me thinking about reading this. And then this, and you know, a couple of others this month. It's got me thinking about another thing about historical fiction, which is, I'd argue, kind of two broad approaches to it. Okay, and one of those approaches is when an author really kind of embeds themselves in the period and they pay really close attention to the, you know, what we know about that period. You know, like Hilary Mantel would in Wolf Hall, say, or you know, they use maybe real historical people and events, as Angharad, Hampshire does in The Mare, or just makes an effort to make sure that the way that their characters live and think are in keeping with the time in which they set the story. And that's a really enjoyable kind of version, way of writing historical fiction. And I think, you know, a few of the ones I mentioned, Days of Life and Whaleful and indeed The Mare, very much fall into that category. But there's another approach to historical fiction, isn't there? Which is to take setting something in the past, taking that setting as just a bouncing off point to do something a little more random or fantastic or imaginative, you know, using it as a way to explore some ideas or not feel obliged to stick to sort of what might have happened at the time or how people might have thought at the time. And Me Ishmaelle falls more into that camp. Okay, but to kind of illustrate what I mean by that sort of variety of historical fiction, I thought I might mention a couple of others that I've enjoyed and that, yeah, epitomise that approach. I mean, one would be The Watchmaker of Filigree Street by Natasha Pulley, which starts with this real event, which is the Victorian Great Exhibition, but then goes off into something that is, you know, basically a fantasy novel. Another example, which I really enjoyed enormously when I read it, I think last year, was Nell Stevens' Briefly a Delicious Life. It's in my mind at the moment because she's got a new novel just out. I'll put details of that below, which I hope to get to read. But that took the real life characters, Georges Sand, the novelist, and Chopin, the musician, and their real life visit to the island of Mallorca in 1838, but then added in a ghost of a girl from the 14th century who, 15th century. She was 14. She was from the 15th century, and she falls in love with Georges Sand, and it's a lovely way of exploring historical events, but with a fantastic element. Lauren Groff, American author, some of her historical fiction, she uses a historical setting, but really what she's looking at is sort of 21st century ideas. Take The Matrix. We're in a sort of medieval convent with nuns, but the way some of those nuns think is like a contemporary woman, and it's a feminist story of ideas that just happens to be set in a medieval monastery. Or Vaster Wilds, 17th century servant girl running off through New England. Is it realistic? Well, it kind of starts vaguely realistic and then becomes sort of less and less so as the novel goes on. And that, in a sense, is what happens with this one. Okay, because it starts by feeling quite realist. We're in the middle of the 19th century. Victoria's on the throne. Ishmael is a girl living in Kent, a real and identifiable part of Kent. She's not well off. She loses both her parents. She's facing some real challenges, and her baby sister dies. So far, so good. It then shifts into something increasingly kind of fantastic and strange, and exploring more contemporary ideas rather than perhaps how a Victorian might have sort of lived or thought, except very much in a Victorian setting with lots of kind of convincing 19th century detail. Xiaolu Guo is a writer who was born in China, 1973, I think. In 2002, she moved to the UK, and since around 2007, she's been publishing books in English, which is her second language, and a variety of different sorts of books. She's also a filmmaker. This is her 6th novel in English. And if that title, Call Me Ishmael, did that set off some kind of little light bulbs of recognition in your mind? That's because it's based on the famous first line of Herman Melville's Moby Dick. So Moby Dick starts with the narrator saying, "Call me Ishmael," but Ishmael, spelled like that. And that's the male narrator of that book tells the story of how he comes to be on a whaler called the Pequod with the maniacal Captain Ahab in his crazy and obsessive pursuit of Moby Dick, the great white whale. And likewise, in this story, the narrator, Ishmael, tells the story of how she ends up on a very similar whaling ship owned by Quakers that set sail from Nantucket in Massachusetts, as Pequod does, and has its own crazed captain who follows the same route and similarly is attempting to catch Moby Dick, the great white whale. So it might loosely, in summary, be described as a feminist retelling of Moby Dick. Now, Does that mean you need to have read Moby Dick before you read this book? I can reassure you, no, you don't. Now, I have read Moby Dick, but I'm very confident that you would not have had to read Moby Dick to enjoy reading this book. But if you have read Moby Dick or know a little bit about it, it will add an extra layer of fun, okay? Because you'll be able to spot the similarities and the differences. The moments when, Xiaolu is really sticking quite closely to the Moby Dick plot. And events and encounters, and has sort of parallel characters to those in Moby Dick, and when she goes off, in a different direction. But it's not necessary. This very much will stand alone, and I say that with confidence. Okay. So let me tell you a little bit more about it. So Ishmael, as I say, teenage girl living in Kent. Father was a carpenter. He's dead. Brother goes off to be a sailor. And she, on her own, lonely, bit lost, doesn't know what to do with herself, and takes it in her head to dress herself as a boy in some of her brother's left behind clothes and get herself on a boat and try out life as a sailor. And it's a slightly far-fetched reason why she sort of decides to do that, but she does. Off she goes. She successfully passes herself off as a youth, and finds herself in America, and decides to sign up on a whaling ship. She, like Melville's Ishmael, she meets a Polynesian harpooner, and it becomes part of quite a multicultural crew on a whaling ship. Now, that is not historically inaccurate. That was true, that a lot of being in the Merchant Navy, or indeed British Navy and others, was a place where you did get significant mix of ethnicities and backgrounds. That was absolutely true. It also was not unknown for women to disguise themselves as men, or cross-dress, or perhaps they were non-binary. We don't know. But in order to sign on as sailors, that's not historically too far-fetched. Like Moby Dick, you get a lot of kind of very realistic detail about life on board ship. How people worked, what they ate, what it smelled like, what the weather was like, how the whales were hunted, rendering the blubber down into whale oil, all that sort of thing. Quite literal detail, but wrapped up in something that is anything but realistic. It becomes more and more bizarre because of the obsession with the great white whale. Captain, but at the same time, it's not identical to Moby Dick in that a number of things are sort of flipped or changed, or so not just Ishmael being a woman, although pretending to be a man, but whereas Captain Ahab was white, Captain Seneca is black, and there's a sort of a American slavery backstory to that. Captain Ahab had a Parsi, that's an Indian Zoroastrian sort of shadowy influencer. In this book, it's Muxi, who's Chinese and a Taoist priest, and he's a sailmaker, but he's also does the I Ching and sort of guides and foretells things for Captain Seneca. So she plays with things in an enjoyable way. I would say, if you're the kind of reader of historical fiction who is really frustrated if you think things are anachronistic or wrong, or someone thinking the way a more modern person would, or the messages are somehow more contemporary than of the time, or little details, if you're going to sit there thinking, did they have puffins in the Kentish marshes? No, I don't think they did. If that's going to bother you, you won't enjoy this. But if you like that kind of historical fiction that just takes the past as a launch pad for doing something, more fantastic or more kind of ideas based, you will enjoy this. And I really liked how Xiaolu is she's looking at using Ishmael to look at what was a very sort of male world, 19th century whaling, through a sort of a woman's eyes and with a different perspective. And she's really exploring some interesting things around sort of cross-cultural encounters, which I think is a theme of in many of her books, though this is the first by her that I've read. Ideas about identity and, finding yourself in different places. And, so if you can sort of cast your realistic expectations to the wind, there is a lot of fun to be had from reading this.